So in the last video, I got cut off talking about the growth of the slave trade. So we're going to continue to talk about slavery in this video and the development of each of the 13 British colonies. In 1632, King Charles I subdivided the vast area that had been the Virginia colony, and he chartered a new colony located on either side of the Chesapeake Bay, and granted control of it to George Calvert, or Lord Baltimore, as a reward for this Catholic nobleman's loyal service to the crown. The king decided to establish proprietorships rather than granting more colonial charters to joint stock companies, because he believed the new arrangement would give him almost total control. It was hoped that a loyal proprietor like Lord Baltimore could be trusted to faithfully carry out the king's policies and wishes. To avoid the intolerance and persecution of Puritans, their Puritan enemies, a number of wealthy English Catholics emigrated into Maryland, and they established large colonial plantations. They were quickly outnumbered, however, by Protestant farmers. Remember that whole rivalry between Protestants and Catholics. Protestants held a majority in Maryland's Representative Assembly, and in 1649, Calvert persuaded the Assembly to adopt what's called the Act of Toleration, which was the first colonial statute granting religious freedom to all Christians. However, the statute also called for the death of anyone who denied the divinity of Jesus. In the late 1600s, Protestant resentment against that Catholic proprietor erupted into a very brief civil war. Protestants triumphed. The Act of Toleration was repealed. Catholics lost their right to vote in elections for the Maryland Assembly. In the 18th century, Maryland's economy and society was much like that of neighboring Virginia, except that in Maryland there was greater tolerance of religious diversity among different Protestant sects. Meanwhile, Virginia is still struggling with a number of problems in the late 17th century, including a rebellion against the colonial government. I'll come back to the slave trade here. Beginning in the 1660s, you've got low tobacco prices due largely to overproduction, and this brought hard times to the Chesapeake colonies, Maryland and Virginia. When Virginia's House of Burgesses attempted to raise tobacco prices, the merchants of London retaliated by raising their own prices on goods exported to Virginia. Sir William Berkeley, the royal governor of Virginia, adopted policies that favored the large planters and used almost dictatorial powers to govern on their behalf. He antagonized backwoods farmers on Virginia's western frontier because he failed to protect their settlements from Indian attacks. So when we're talking about backwoods farmers, those would be people who had worked for and eventually earned their freedom. Nathaniel Bacon, an impoverished gentleman, he's newly arrived from England. He seized upon the grievances of the Western farmers, and he led a rebellion against Berkeley's government. Bacon and the others resented the economic and political control that was exercised by those large planters in the Chesapeake area, and he raised an army of volunteers in 1676 and conducted a series of raids and massacres against Indian villages on the Virginia frontier. Although it's short-lived, Bacon's rebellion, or the Chesapeake Revolution, highlighted two long-lasting disputes in colonial Virginia. One, you've got sharp class differences between the wealthy farmers and the free immigrants or indentured servants. And two, there is colonial resistance to royal control. So the Chesapeake colonies will grow slowly. Retarding their growth in the early decades was an unhealthy climate and a high death rate due both to disease and Indian attacks. The tobacco industry requires extensive labor, which initially was not available. So they were hiring indentured servants. And then, as another method for attracting immigrants, Virginia was also offering 50 acres of land to each immigrant who paid for his own passage, or any plantation owner who paid for an immigrant's passage. So you've got even more indentured servants who are coming over. The slave trade is going to grow in the British colonies due to reduced migration. There are fewer Europeans coming over into the colonies after a certain amount of time. So fewer people, so there's still a demand for labor. The first Africans come to Virginia arriving in a slave ship operated by that Dutch trader in 1619. And remember, they will eventually become slaves. So the first Africans are just indentured servants, but eventually we'll see the evolution of slavery. There's a dependable workforce in these Africans. They're working hard, and they will continue to work for more than an indentured servant would. And overall, that's a cheaper labor system, and so that's what the colonies will eventually adopt. Other colonies will also establish themselves. In 1620, the Puritans, who sought to purify the Church of England, come over and they settle at Plymouth, establishing the colony of Massachusetts. The Puritans have a very strict religious code of law that they will attempt to follow in the Puritan colony of Massachusetts. The Puritans also have this belief that there are dissenters out there, or dissidents. So Puritan leaders are intolerant of anyone who questions the religious teachings in the Plymouth colony. A common method for dealing with dissidents or dissenters was to banish them from the Bay Colony, Massachusetts Bay. These descendants formed the nucleus for the founding of several new colonies in New England, which would ultimately develop into Rhode Island and Connecticut. Roger Williams went to Boston in 1631 as a respected Puritan minister. He believed, however, that the individual's conscience was beyond the control of any civil or church authority. His teachings on this point placed him in conflict with other Puritan leaders who ordered his banishment from the Bay Colony. Leaving Boston, Williams fled southward, where he and a few followers founded the settlement of Providence in 1636. The new colony was unique in two respects. First, it recognized the Williams government, that the Williams government would protect the rights of Native Americans, and it would pay them for the use of their land. Williams government also provided for complete religious toleration. It allowed Catholics, Quakers, and Jews to worship freely. In addition to founding Providence and later Rhode Island, Williams also founded one of the first Baptist churches in America. Another dissident or dissenter who questioned the doctrines of the Puritan authorities was Anne Hutchinson. She believed the idea that faith alone, not deeds, was necessary for salvation. She's also a woman who led Bible teachings in her house, which you were not allowed to do under Puritan law in Massachusetts Bay. So Anne Hutchinson and a group of followers founded the colony of Portsmouth in 1638, which was not far from Williams' colony of Providence. A few years later, Anne Hutchinson migrated to Long Island and was killed in an Indian uprising. We've also got New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the colony founded in New England. It was originally part of Massachusetts Bay. It consisted of a few settlements north of Boston. To the west of Rhode Island, the fertile Connecticut River Valley attracted other settlers who were unhappy with the Massachusetts authorities. Reverend Thomas Hooker led a large group of Boston Puritans into the valley and founded the colony of Hartford in 1636. The Hartford settlers then drew up the first written constitution in American history, called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It established a representative government consisting of a legislature elected by popular vote and a governor chosen by that legislature. South of Hartford, second settlement in the Connecticut Valley was started by John Davenport and was later called New Haven. In the 1660s, a generation had passed since the founding of the first Puritan colonies in New England. The new native-born generation showed signs of being less committed to religious faith, more interested in material success. How was the Puritan church to remain strong if younger people failed to become members? In an effort to maintain the church's influence and membership, they came up with the halfway covenant. It's offered by the clergyman to those who profess limited religious commitment. In other words, people could now take part in church services and activities without making a formal declaration of their total belief in Christ. Other ministers rejected the halfway covenant and denounced it from the pulpit. Nevertheless, as the years passed, strict Puritan practices were weakened in most New England communities in order to maintain church membership. You know what? I'll come back to Maryland. Actually, yeah, I think I'm done with Maryland. So this is a picture of Lord Baltimore here. Remember, Maryland had that act of toleration for Catholics and practiced religious toleration. In the 1640s, the various New England colonies were constantly faced with the threat of attack from the Native Americans. Because of the Civil War then being fought in England, also called the Puritan Revolution, the colonists could expect very little assistance. So in 1643, 4 New England colonies, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Haven, formed a military alliance known as the New England Confederation. The Confederation was directed by a board comprised of 2 representatives from each colony. It had very little powers to act on boundary disputes, very little powers for the return of runaway servants, and very little power in dealings with Native Americans. So the Confederation only lasted until 1684, when colonial rivalries and the end of the Civil War, so renewed control by the English monarch, brought this experiment in colonial cooperation to an end. It is important, however, because it established a precedent for colonies taking unified action toward a common purpose. So as the Puritan Civil War is going on, the colonies now are learning to make money for themselves. They're becoming a lot more independent. They learn how to build ships and export lumber. They got very good at fishing and small-scale farming, subsistence farming for just yourself. Only a few years before its demise, that confederation helped the New England colonists cope successfully with a dire threat. A chief of the Wampanoags called Metacom, known to the colonists as King Philip. He united many of the tribes in southern New England against the English settlers, who were constantly encroaching on the Native Americans' land. So you've got all of these different tribes involved in King Philip's war. King Philip, in his vicious war, killed thousands of people. There's thousands of Native Americans who are killed also. Dozens of towns and villages are burned. Eventually, the colonial forces manage to prevail. King Philip will be killed, and that will virtually end Native American resistance in New England.